Welcome to the Higher Love with Megan podcast with me, your host, Megan Cooper, a holistic coach and trauma-informed practitioner. This podcast seeks to break out of the echo chamber of societal narratives that perpetuate our institutions and challenge the status quo of wellness and beyond. Join me as we decolonize our minds, address and use our privilege, and prioritize inclusivity. Here, diverse experiences are honoured, and together we are fostering a space that stands for higher love for all. As a listener, you are not just here to passively consume. You're an ambassador for deep healing and societal evolutions, ready to engage in thought-provoking, challenging conversations. As your host, I'm committed to providing ever-expansive spaces that inspire us to contribute to a world defined by higher love. Thank you for joining me on this journey.
So in this episode of High Love with Megan, I, Lucy Lucraft, Megan's podcast producer, flip the script and interview her. So one of the things that Megan and I talk about quite a lot is that we don't always get to hear enough of Megan. She is so incredible, and she wouldn't say this herself, but she's such an incredible human. She's so eloquent, she's so passionate, and people need to hear more of her. So in this episode, I ask her a series of questions about the reason she started her podcast, the reason for her pivot, some of her favourite episodes, some of the sticky things that she feels vulnerable about, and she also asks me some questions too. Now, even though I'm a producer, there are a little bit of audio issues at the beginning of the episode, and my kids are on half term and are unexpectedly home with me today. They weren't supposed to be. So there were some sound issues at the beginning, which meant that I kind of jumped in, had to cut out a chunk and jumped into the episode, which is why I'm doing this intro for you now, so you understand what happened and what the point of the episode is. Anyway, I hope you really, really enjoy it. It's a really great episode and a way to get to know Megan better. Enjoy.
I guess that perhaps the seed was planted quite early on in life. When I was 15, I did GCSE work placement at a local radio station. And I actually ended up, after my placement, they took me on to do one morning breakfast show a week. And I really enjoyed hosting the breakfast show and just had so much fun with it. And I actually thought for a little while about going into radio work as a career. Didn't end up going in that direction, but I think I always enjoyed the collaborating, interviewing, being part of fun conversations, and that seed was planted. And then when, of course, podcasting started to be a thing, because I know that it's been around for a while, but it's certainly not, it was never as big as it is now. So when it started to become more of a thing, it was something that I always wanted to do. But it did take quite a lot of personal development to get over the hurdles of believing I had interesting things to say, or people would be interested in what I wanted to put out there, and to get over those little hurdles of getting in my own way. And then I started the podcast kind of 2021. And actually, in the end of kind of me just getting over those hurdles, it was just I just want to put conversations out which I find fun, which I find interesting. It's an opportunity for me to collaborate with other people, because when you're a coach or a solopreneur, as they call it, you are just doing your own thing. So it was just an opportunity for me to collaborate with other people. And the net was quite wide on that. It was all any avenue of holistic health. So it was just kind of anyone that I found interesting, whose work I was inspired by. But it was quite broad, I would say, the area. My interest in holistic health is generally quite broad. And then I continued on until, the end of last year, so the end of 2023. And then I had a gap. So, that was the inception of the podcast. Yeah, I think that answers the question, doesn't it?
Right.
I think one of the stories that I had, and that still occasionally comes up, is that no one's going to be interested in what I have to say. I think that I did work on that, and of course, yeah, I do have these interesting things to talk about. Why wouldn't someone be interested in those things? But actually, I think that the kind of turning point was, do I just want to create this even if nobody ever listened? And the answer to that was yes. If there's a quote which I loved in a book by Rebecca Campbell, something along the lines of, what you put out into the world, when it's out there, it's actually none of your business. It's just you create it, it's out there, and how other people receive it is up to them, but you're the creator of it, and you don't have to be responsible for any other part of how it's received and shared, etc., which was really meaningful to me. And I was like, yeah, I actually do just want to create this. The act of the creation is enough for me. So that was enough kind of development around that. And then, of course, once you start putting things out there, and it's a bit like being at the gym. It's like you start putting the reps in, and then you realise that, oh, it's not actually as hard as I thought it was, or it's not as challenging as I thought it was. And then you just keep on going. So that was definitely one thing that came up. And then I think that actually when I had the podcast pivot, which I know that we'll probably talk more about, there was this other fear that then came up around being misunderstood, going into a new direction, which again is uncertain territory. And then this other fear comes up of like really sticking your head above the parapet, especially because a big part of what I'm wanting to do now is shake up wellness and going a little bit against the status quo and go and challenge societal narratives. And of course, there's all the kind of unhealed stuff that comes up around really putting yourself out there, the pushback, other people not liking it, other people not understanding it. And then I think that with that, I think there was this tipping point where it just became something that I couldn't not do. Like I couldn't keep going, not challenging the status quo, or not challenging or not bringing to light things that I was seeing.
Yeah.
And when that tipping point happened, then it just, became something that I couldn't not do. And of course that comes up sometimes when I'm like edging towards perhaps putting myself out there in a bigger and bigger way. But I think that comes up for a lot of people. And I loved something that Siobhan Strode said in our episode about rocking the boat, where she was saying that we all have this thing about rocking the boat, not wanting to rock the boat, but actually the boat's the problem. The boat is the thing that needs rocking. And that made so much sense to me. I was like, oh yeah, we're all in this boat of status quo, not wanting to challenge anything, but actually it's the boat that does need to tip over. That was like a real kind of reframe for me of, oh yeah, the boat does need the rocking. Yeah.
Let's talk about the pivot. I know the answer to this question, but for everybody else, did you have a clear vision of what the pivot would look like? Or has it evolved organically since that first urge to change?
Yeah, I think so. I came to an organic close with the podcast last November. So nearly a year ago. And just had a break. And I felt like there was something else that was coming, something else that was emerging. I didn't want to stop the podcast. I really wanted to continue, but I knew that it was taking on a different direction. And I wasn't really clear of what that was. And then I think we originally had a conversation back in January time where I was saying to you, I want to change something, and these are the types of conversations, and it's going in this direction. And you actually reflected back to me, I think you've got a very clear idea of where it's going. And I think I was a lot clearer than I actually thought. And I think that there were a few different strands to that. Firstly, I was nearly at the end of my 1-year training with Compassionate Inquiry, Gabor Mate's organisation, which deals with therapy, which is a therapeutic approach to trauma and addiction therapy. And within that, we had watched a lot of lectures, guest workshops on topics around collective trauma, which was to do with the impact of trauma on Indigenous communities, racial trauma, systemic trauma that exists within all systems around education, around healthcare, around the prison system. And I think it really opened up my eyes to things that are not talked about within the wellness industry. These emojis keep popping up.
I know.
I'm doing these hand gestures. I'm noticing those. I'm like, I never know how to turn these off. But anyway, but I think these conversations had really opened up my eyes to things that I was very moved by, that I really cared about, that I was inspired by, and really wanted to bring to people's attention as well, rather than what I see certainly on Instagram, this kind of superficial consumption of wellness data. And so that was a big thing that was happening. The second thing was that over the last few years, I've been doing an increasing amount of work with volunteer work with local authorities, which is not just giving a workshop to a certain demographic of people. I was working with people from all different walks of life, all different backgrounds, all different types of neurodivergency, different levels of trauma, people who've been through the prison system, homelessness, addiction, and the disparity of what some people have access to within wellness, people who can pay for therapy, pay for coaching, pay for high-ticket programs, compared to the vast majority of people who can't afford to pay for therapy, coaching and support. Seeing the disparity that was present, I really wanted to start to have more conversations within the coaching world or therapy world of how we can start to actually bridge that gap and make more information, make wellness more accessible and actually more grounded too, because I think that there's certainly, from my perspective, I witnessed quite a lot of bypassing. I witnessed quite a lot of speaking to a certain demographic of person and not to everyone. And also within that, recognizing my own place within that. As a white cisgender woman, I recognized, I have actually been speaking to a certain type of person and not to this collective audience that actually I wanted to start to be a part of. So that was also happening. Also, alongside that was what we were starting to witness over the past year in regards to Palestine, what was happening in Gaza, and all of these other aspects of things happening across the world, where I was like, I'm seeing that, and then I'm seeing, okay, by this program, and the kind of disparity between that was also like, I was starting to feel like I was in the Truman Show of like, how am I in wellness, but I'm not standing for like wellness for everyone. So I think all of these things were starting to happen, that then I was coming to this place of, I guess it's wanting my podcast to stand for something that felt really real to me and that felt important to me and felt challenging for me, because a lot of these conversations are challenging around all good. House still standing. Yeah, I wanted to open myself up to these conversations, because they weren't conversations that I was having. And I think one of the beautiful things that I've shared with you, and shared actually on the episode that I did with Joel Burgess, which we released a few weeks ago on my podcast, one of the things that I really wanted, and one of the things that I enjoy about my podcast, is that every conversation that I have opens my eyes to another aspect of understanding more about collective healing and collective liberation. Because I don't have to be the expert in this. I'm only at the beginning of understanding how far my biases go, addressing my own privilege, understanding different levels of things that I've neglected, ways that I haven't showed up, ways that I want to show up. And me being able to interact with great guests each week also takes me on that journey. And that's what I wanted for my listeners too, for us really to go from like a starting point and to go on that journey together, which for me is like every week I have this beginner's mindset around a different aspect of addressing privilege or understanding collective trauma. So for me, my podcast is now like an arena of learning as well for myself as well as my listeners. So that's what I really wanted from the pivot. And I think that last November, that was emerging. But I mean, you've certainly been an incredible help in crystallizing that process along the course of this year. So yeah, it feels really exciting and it feels very purposeful, I would say. I'd say that my podcast now feels very purposeful. Yeah.
Was there recording, or maybe even when you released and shared an episode, where you felt like this podcast has found its voice?
Ooh. Do you know what? I actually think that with my solo episode of breaking out of the wellness echo chamber, that for me was a real, this podcast has found its voice. And that was only the first episode with the pivot. But for me, even thinking about the things that I was sharing there, that was a big deal for me. Like coming back onto the podcast, which had been all around holistic health, and then being like, no, this is what I'm now doing. This is the direction that it's going in. Please join me on that. I'm going on that journey anyway. That was a real, this has found its voice. But I think that with every episode, the podcast feels like it's finding its voice. There was one episode, a couple of ones on from that, which I did with Kerry Jarvis, who I know is a friend of yours, disrupting the wellness industry. People still share that now, a couple of months on, a few months on, when people discover it. And I'm reminded every time of the absolute gems. And gems is almost, doesn't sound disruptive enough. They're like
the bombs.
The bombs that Kerry was throwing in left, right and centre. I love her content so much. But that for me was a real, this is what this is about. So that was a really amazing one. But I feel, every single episode is part of the podcast finding its voice. And perhaps with every episode as well, it's like I feel like the podcast is constantly evolving and finding its voice. Yeah.
That's the episode that I was thinking of as well, the episode with Kerry. And also, it's the one that has stayed with me the most, even though Kerry is someone I've known for a long time. It never ceases to amaze me how intelligent and big-hearted and just incredible she is. The thing that actually you and I often will talk about offline is, I feel like I quote her episode the most, but the one thing that she says about, we will come away from every conversation changed.
Yeah.
You and I will have left this conversation changed. And so I sometimes think that people don't really appreciate the power of these conversations that you're having. It might just seem, oh, you're just talking to different people and it's just a podcast, blah, 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 blah. But every single conversation you have is leaving both you and your guest fundamentally, irrevocably changed in some way or another. And that just ripples out, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You mentioned in the very beginning that you were creating content for content's sake, and that was good enough. And you really enjoyed the process of producing podcast episodes. And you mentioned that one of the other kind of benefits was collaborating. And something that I always say to people as a benefit of starting a podcast that I think people don't necessarily think is that you network. And obviously now you're networking into different, less familiar kind of areas. How has that been on your nervous system and all the rest of it? Because it's quite vulnerable, isn't it?
It is. I suppose I've got a couple of things to say to that. And perhaps for people listening, they can resonate with this. But I suppose, and I know that you feel this too, that over the last year, with this disparity of what we've been witnessing going on through our screens happening in Palestine, and also horrendous things happening in other areas of the world, I have felt, and as I know you have, frustration, challenge, anger, grief, all of the things around more people within wellness not talking about this stuff. And I suppose that I started to see a gap between what was real or present for me and where other wellness practitioners were in their process with that. And I think that there is a challenge of us feeling disconnected when we're experiencing that. But what I shared this with Kerry last week. I sent her a message to be like, another flip side of that is that over the course of this last year of feeling disconnected in other areas or other kind of connections online, I have had to seek out other people that I feel connected to. And on the back of that, I feel like I have such a love-hate relationship with social media and communication and stuff in general, but it does present us with this incredible platform to connect with aligned people. And I've really noticed that this year. I've really started to appreciate people that like Leah Kim, she's the podcast host of Voices on the Side. I love her podcast. I cannot champion that podcast enough. I love it. And being able to bounce messages back from somebody who's got similar values to you, similar intentions to you, and feel like you've got like running buddies across the world who are interested in the same thing. I've actually started to really appreciate that, and I think that has made reaching out to people easier in a way, because I know that we have this shared purpose and shared ground and desire to challenge the status quo and improve accessibility and diversity and inclusivity within wellness. So that's one thing that's been happening within that. I also used to have a story that I almost had to earn who I had on my show next. Oh, I'll invite this person on when I've interviewed a few more people, or where I've become a bit better as a host, or whatever the story is. We're always making these stories up about I'll be ready when. Yeah. And actually, I've just stopped doing that, which you've probably noticed too. Yeah. I've just been a bit like, fuck it, I'm not going to message that person in 3 months or 6 months. Like, why don't I just do it now? The worst thing that can happen is they're going to say no. And I've been quite bold about that. Lisa Lister was actually when I started my podcast in 2021, Lisa Lister was the person that I was like, she's top of the tower for me of people I want to reach out to. Last November, I just sent her a card in the post. I wrote to her, sent her a birthday card and was like, please be on my podcast. And it took her a long time to message me back. But then in July, I interviewed her. And she was like, oh my God, you're the first person that's ever sent me a birthday card to ask me to be on a podcast. Amazing. Of course I'm going to be on.
That is a tip for people.
Right,
surprise and delight.
Totally. But that was amazing. And like in July, I interviewed her in July and we released the episode, I think the following month. But that was like a big deal for me. And I've taken that on, and with Fritzi Horstman, who we published an episode with last week, Compassion Prison Project. I would say, and I shared this on the podcast, she's the reason that I went into studying trauma, that I studied compassionate inquiry with Gabor Mate. Her video Step Inside the Circle, when I saw that on the Wisdom of Trauma documentary, was so profoundly moving to me. That's what inspired me to go on the course within my professional development that I have. So for me, when I started the podcast pivot, I was like, I'd love to get her on the podcast. And I thought, I'll do it in 6 months or 12 months, once I've got a few more reps under my belt. And then I just had this moment of, fuck it, I'm just going to message her. And I went through the conventional channels of media, Compassion Prison, whatever it is, the kind of official channels, and I wasn't getting any responses. So I just thought, I'm just going to slide into her DMs, which I did, and just messaged her directly, and she was like, yeah, great, let's do it. And I think that as I've started to do this a little bit more, I've just thought, I'm just going to message this person, and if they don't reply, then good. They're not good. If they don't reply, then fine. And if they reply, then great. Yeah. So I think in answer to your question around like, how have I found that? There is, I guess, a question mark that comes up of, will this person want to be on my podcast? But then the worst thing that can happen is they say no, and I've just become a little bit more accustomed to that and okay with that.
Yeah. I think that is, this is such a gift for any wannabe podcasters out there, because just ask, just pitch. You don't have to be at a certain level to get a guest. And I do remember us having conversations where you were more worried at the beginning. What if they don't understand that if they look at my previous episodes or the ones that are out there, they won't get it.
Yeah.
And I think you've just been really brave and really proactive and great at flexing that muscle of just feeling the discomfort in asking people before you're ready.
Yeah.
And some amazing things have come from it.
Yeah, totally. And I'm sure that's just going to keep on going, because I think like with any new territory, there's always going to be that part of you that's, I'm doing a new thing, I'm pushing out of the comfort zone. Yeah. So I'm sure that feeling's going to come up time and time again.
Yeah. Okay. A question that I am often asked as a podcast producer is it's normally around download numbers or it's around the success, basically. And I will always challenge, because the success of a podcast is really so subjective. But how do you measure success of your podcast?
Firstly, I think it's okay to normalise the fact that we live in a capitalist, competitive, progress-driven society, which has conditioned our minds to look at the numbers and I have this idea of success. Actually, I read a news article at the weekend which was talking about Joe Rogan's podcast, which was he gets 17.6 million downloads on his podcast, and I was like, oh, I'm quite a bit off from that. And my next thought was like, maybe I shouldn't measure myself against the Joe Rogan podcast,
like the number world. Yeah, maybe
that's okay. But I think like I just wanted to bring that in because I think that it's just part of our conditioned mindset. That is part of it. Yeah. But in answer to your question, how do I measure success? I would say now with my podcast, following my podcast pivot, it's am I being aligned and authentic to my why and what is important for me, my intention with the podcast, the conversations that I want to be having, how much I feel I am rocking the boat, challenging the status quo. That's the intention behind my podcast. So I think with every conversation, is it doing that? Is it part of this process? And as long as it's doing that, then I do see it as successful because it's also what I'm intending to put out into the world.
Yeah.
And I really see it as a long-term project. I want to be having these conversations as long as I'm here. So I suppose that it's the whole jargon of it's a marathon, not a sprint. Yeah. So as long as I'm having conversations each week, as long as I'm growing as a host and as a listener and putting things out there which are meaningful to me that I feel are adding conversation in the right adding to the conversation in a positive way. And I'm standing for inclusive diversity, accessibility within wellness, then I feel like that's successful for me.
Lush. That is a good answer, I think. My final question is, looking back, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Over all of the podcast?
Yeah.
I think that's a hard one because I don't know. I always feel like with these things, it played out exactly how it needed to be where I am today. Yeah. Could I have pivoted earlier? No, probably not, because I also needed to get myself as an individual to a place of wanting to have these conversations. A year before that, my eyes weren't even open to having these conversations. So I couldn't have done anything differently. And I think that the podcast has evolved as I have evolved. So unless I had been a different person or made different choices, I don't feel like the podcast could have been any different. And I'm also glad that it has had this kind of contrast of just coming from holistic health and wellness and the more, what I would see as like the more like love and light arena, yeah, to more let's have the sticky conversations. I like that contrast because it also, I think, is a reflection of the journey. Whoa, firework emojis. Whoa. It's still doing it. I don't know how to make that stop. Okay.
I love it.
The Riverside celebrating with us. I feel like it is almost a kind of metaphor for the journey that I've also been on as an individual, as a practitioner, coach, therapist. Like, yeah, I feel like it is, it couldn't have been any other way.
I love that answer. It's perfect.
Of course, I'd probably be a bit better at technology or like a bit better at, I don't know, efficient, streamlined systems. I'm trying every day. No, I think is the answer.
And have you got any questions for me?
Yeah, I do. What episodes have you enjoyed as a listener?
Ooh, I loved Sophie's episode.
Knew you were going to say that.
I loved it. It was so good. It was really challenging and different, and she just shows up as her whole self, says it with her whole chest, and I'm just here for that. I'm here for seeing women standing in their power and being challenging. Yeah, I just loved that episode. Fritzi's was brilliant because I've also obviously watched the video, and I also knew how important it is in your journey. Like all of them, but Sophie's, yeah, obviously Kerry's I love Kerry, Siobhan. I'm not going to list out literally every single one. And I also, for me, I suppose from a producer point of view, I really like the episodes where I see kind of growth happening or different narratives, because I listen to a lot of podcasts, I edit a lot of podcasts. So even though an episode I know will be good from a listener point of view, it might not always land with me or stay with me. And that's okay. It doesn't need to, because it's about the listener. But I really love the episode with you and Casper. I really liked that because we came up with that as a last minute kind of thing, I think. Or maybe not last minute, but it wasn't something that was initially in the plan.
Yeah.
And it was just really lovely. And I always like when hosts flip the script a bit and then have somebody interview them, because you get to see their personality a lot more. And especially if they're with a partner, there's just a whole different vibe. Yeah, so I really like that episode. And I'm glad that we're going to be doing more of those as well.
Yeah, totally. Great.
Excuse me.
What, as a listener, would you like more of?
Would I like more of? I would love more. Ooh, that's tough. I think I would like more very marginalised voices. They're my favourite. The ones that you're not going to hear everywhere else. Yeah. That's not a very good answer.
No, it is.
Because I remembered Leah Kim as well. I liked her episode a lot. Yeah, I like hearing from like the circuit breakers, like the episodes that make you stop the scroll and oh wow, I never thought of that. That's why I really liked Sophie's, because I would never have come across her at all. The algorithm would keep us apart.
Yeah.
And so those are so maybe even in a way, the episodes that I would like to see more of are the ones where I don't necessarily agree with the perspective or haven't thought of that perspective.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that are most help you to grow, I think. Yeah.
I love that. And just to build on that, because it was really interesting with the Sophie episode, and I love that's one of your favourites, if not your favourite, because I knew when I was going to have that conversation with Sophie, I was like, wow, Lucy's standpoint and Sophie's standpoint around the arena of feminism, I was like, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah.
But I loved that actually, despite the fact that you have different definitions, different ideologies and different viewpoints around feminism, you actually had this place where you overlapped and where you could, which actually you were both, it's almost, you had the same direction of
you want the same outcome.
Yes,
we
exactly.
come at it
it's
from
like
a completely
same,
different point
totally.
of view.
It's like you want the same outcome, but from a totally different viewpoint and different voices. And actually, it was really interesting, I think, for both you and I, because we both recognised that we need everyone's different opinions and voices, and everyone being in their own unique genius in order to get to the place within society that we want to be. And I think that was an important thing for me actually as well. I think we're in this place of polarization and separateness online where it's so easy. You just look at the comment section of any post and it's, no, you're wrong, you're this, you're that. It's so judgmental, it's so separate. But actually, if we can tune into, or like, how is this person challenging my viewpoint? How are they supporting it? How are they opposing it? What is our common ground? When we can start to just be a bit more curious about things as opposed to, no, this is the way, then I think that's going to be far more connecting for a society anyway. So I think that was a really interesting episode for all of us. I love that. What, as a producer, would you like more?
I would always like to see things that are going to challenge you, because not necessarily the people who you know, who you love, you know a lot about them. I would love to see, people that are going to challenge you, and maybe people that you, I don't know, I'm not talking about like pushing you into interviews like Piers Morgan or something. But
like, eaten alive.
You would humble him. But like people that you're not necessarily, I know exactly how, I know how this is going to end. Yeah. Because I think that would really, that's just such growth. as a host. It's a really good lesson as a podcast host, as an interviewer, to be showing up and interviewing somebody you wouldn't necessarily have chosen and don't even necessarily want to interview.
Yeah.
Not in a triggered, that person causes harm and they do not align with my values and I don't want anything to do with it, but more, I don't know what the point of this episode is going to be. I trust my producer. Let's just be curious and see if it works. And if it doesn't, we scrap it. Yeah. So that's what I would like to see.
Excellent. I will expect a list of people who you like to put me into that setting with. Wonderful. Yeah, great. I felt in my nervous system like, oh, a little bit of activation. Okay, new area of growth. Wonderful. Let's do that. Okay, lastly, where do you as a producer see me going next with the podcast? The types of episodes. Yeah.
I think you're so early in this journey, in this part of your journey. I've seen such massive growth in your comfort levels and how you're showing up that I almost feel like I would like to see you just fit into the groove a bit more, get into the swing of things and feel comfortable with your kind of workflow. Yeah, and then interviewing people that I've suggested that you don't necessarily want to interview. That's where I'd like to see.
Great.
That's what I'm looking forward to.
I'm down for it. Yes. More of the same, but bigger and better continuously.
Exactly. Just simple, right?
Yeah. Perfect. Well, thanks so much for the conversation. And thanks so much for your expertise and wisdom and incredible podcasting skills. As always, you've been, as I've said to you before, you've been such an incredible support and expander for this podcast. So it's just great to have you on board.
Thank you so much. You're brilliant.
Thank you for listening. It's great to have you with me on this journey towards higher love for all. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. Please do take a moment to rate and review the show, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. All links, references and contact information is detailed too within the show notes. And I always love to hear your feedback, so feel free to hit me up on my Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan or via my website higher-love.com. Send your takeaways, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share or send on to someone else who would benefit. Until next time, big love.